Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Don Trubshaw. He's a graduate of the Unification Theological Seminary in 1989. He's also a member of the 6,000 Couples Blessing Group from 1982. He also was studying and teaching in Sun Moon University between 1993 and 94. His family are national Messiahs to Norway. They've also had spent some time living in Japan. Currently, they live in Derby, and he is just about completing his PhD in institutional values transmission, which I'm told is something to do with the philosophy of education. So let's invite him to speak.
Yeah. So I've entitled my talk three critiques of the Cheon Constitution. Although when I actually came to sort of, after writing it, I came to sort of add them up. I wasn't quite sure whether it's three or more. But anyway, I stuck with that title. I wanted to start with two quotations, one from the beginning of Divine Principle and one from the beginning of the Constitution, which I'm sure you will recognise those. The very opening of the Divine Principle. This always struck me, and I'm sure many of those who joined in at the same time can say the same thing. A certain approach to understanding spiritual things, really beginning in a way with human experience, and not the assertion of a doctrine, but actually with what it is to be human in a sense, and what it is like the goal to which we're all striving. That is happiness. So, to my way of thinking, that has always been fundamental. That actually, whatever we do, even if it involves some difficulty along the way, is for the establishment of a society, in which and with which people are going to be happy in some measure. And that was a sort of instinctive reaction. But my instinctive reaction reading the Constitution is very different. It's that actually there's a sense of foreboding, that it seems something actually rather oppressive and not answering to that fundamental desire that we have to be happy. And I mean, not just those of us who joined the movement, but of course, people everywhere, which of course was the point about the principal's statement here, that this is a universal thing. So if you look at the language, it's very different. Even from the beginning, it's talking about ordering our life, in a sense, telling us how we should live. Of course, there may be an element to that in finding human happiness, but I worry about the very approach and the very language in which these things are expressed. Within my experience, and I obviously discussing with members over many years and thinking about this, it seemed there were always sort of three ideas about what the future of the unification movement would be. One is this idea of theocratic socialism in a way. It talks about the year of common cause and so on, but also of like a world ruled by God, by God's law. Then, of course, there was a more general idea within the movement of the movement would expand and would in a way achieve unification through some sort of interaction with different religions, but eventually, would sort of predominate in some way, but in a very sort of gentle way, if you like. Then, of course, I think there is another idea as well, which has not been so well articulated, of a general sort of cultural movement based on Father's ideas, principles, values, which would, in a way, affect, in a sort of like concentric circles, in a way, would affect everyone in a global society to some degree. So I think it's fair to say that when we read the Constitution, it's very clear that the idea that comes across most clearly is this first one, the sort of theocratic socialism. That might be I put it in inverted commas, might be exactly the right term, but something along those lines that we're talking about. I've just chosen three things here because I think what's fundamental to our experience and to the things, in a sense, that we desire, I think there are two very strong forces in human life which underlie any idea of what a good society is, and of course, which in some ways a constitution should reflect. And that is, one is, of course, the idea of freedom, which is something that has motivated practically all change in human history. The desire to liberate oneself from enslavement or, dominating forces. And, that's been a very, very strong motivator. The other, of course, is in a way an opposite, a polar opposite, and that is the sense of belonging. And I think those two have to be, in many respects, in balance if we're to talk about what a good society is. It's something in which we feel we belong, but also something in which we find freedom. And I think people have already mentioned these points, so I needn't dwell on them, that I think the Constitution is fairly dismissive. I mean, they are mentioned, but then, of course, the critical one here is that the Article 20, that the freedoms and rights can be constrained by law for the sake of firm establishment. That undermines almost any other mention of freedom within the Constitution. I'm not going to read these out. You can have a look at them. When we talk about freedom and the good society, we often take a very short view of this. But if we think about, like, modernity, what's happened in the last, say, 6 centuries, we see that actually there's been incredible progress. And if we look at all these things and think, how have these things all come about? How have all these things been won? And these have, contributed considerably to the very life that we have. And the fact that we can sort of we're at liberty to sit in this room and talk about these things without any concerns or worries, which is not true in many societies, even today. And I worry that none of these things are really, there isn't a sort of historical context to this Constitution. It's as if we're just drawing a line under history and saying, okay, let's start again, without real reference to these points. So I think these are fundamental assumptions that are made about society, which I find very questionable. The next thing I want to look at is something that's already been talked about today. That's assumptions about divinity. And the Article 4, number 1, true parents are the original ancestors of mankind as the perfected embodiment of God. This, of course, we can think of this in a sense of religious absolutism. It was exactly, I forget exactly who made this point this morning, but this was a thing that attracted many of us to the very fact that the idea that Jesus was not God created a whole new possibility. And I think that the fact that we've come back to this idea is worrying because of the historical precedents. That religious absolutism, which is equated with the deification of a leader, leads almost inevitably on to certain developments. The elevation of a powerful group, the assertion of orthodoxy, the suppression of dissent, and the monopoly of power. And as somebody else has already mentioned, we're probably on the edge of seeing that now, certainly the assertion of orthodoxy. This idea itself has, as I say, it has worrying precedents. It's an idea which actually you can go all the way back to, the beginnings of recorded history. It's a motif that runs practically through sort of every culture, the idea of the divine man or the divine king. It's actually the thing that the Old Testament prophets spoke against. It was, that they were the sort of the word of God speaking against power, which of course Jesus did. And of course, True Father himself was, in that sense, a prophetic figure, speaking to power, as it were. We see the example of the medieval popes who were, if not considered divine, at least having that sort of quality of speaking absolutely for God. We see the re-emergence of this idea even in sort of culture, in modernity, in Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman. I think we'd be more familiar with it. And of course the effect that that had on Nazism. A couple of other examples here: the Japanese deification of the emperor, and of course the deification of the dynasty in North Korea. These are all sort of worrying precedents about when this starts to occur. Okay, I want to take issue, which is sort of the third critique about sort of assumptions about human nature. I want to take issue with something Peter said. You said the Constitution will make us reliant on the quality of people in power. I would say, actually, that's completely the wrong way of looking at it. Plato came up with this question right at the beginning of sort of the history of philosophy. Who should rule us? I mean, he said the philosopher kings, but other people have basically taken that question, which Plato formulated, and come up with their own ideas about how it should rule. So I've got a list of the various sort of ideas that people have come up with at various times. But I think the question is the wrong one. I think the question is not, we shouldn't be actually looking at who is right to rule us. A famous philosopher of the 20th century, Karl Popper, who was one of the greatest critics of Marxism, he said, that's the wrong question. What we should be asking is, how can we get rid of bad leaders without bloodshed? And of course, the answer is basically through the democratic process, everything involved in free and fair elections. What if I just go back? I presume I press that to go back. Yeah, right. Okay. Just go back, and underlying those questions are assumptions about human nature. Plato assumed, and of course many people since have assumed, that there are a certain group of people who can be trusted with power. But Popper's point, and I think the point which is very relevant to is, nobody fundamentally can be trusted with power, however virtuous they are. So, somebody might be a saint. If you give them absolute power, you will set in motion something which is, can be terrifying, and the consequences can be very serious. That is why, in this whole process of modernity, we've tried to take down the structures of centralized power to spread power more widely and to give people a measure of empowerment over their own lives. Okay, I've come up with some critiques, which I know, of course, have covered a lot of the ground people already covered this morning. I want to say, though, that I think, the project for a constitution is not perhaps totally wrong, but I think it has to be understood in certain ways. I've used a term here, intentionality. It's something from sort of philosophy, psychology. What it means basically is how we are orientated towards the world, how we sort of think about things. And basically, of relevance to our discussion, I think, are three particular orientations: the religious, the moral, and the social. And I think they help us to perhaps understand that what's happened here, I believe, is a sort of categorical mistake, where, underlying the very project of the Constitution, and yet possibly if we understand it in the right way, we can perhaps put things in a sort of proper order. So first of all, what do I mean by the religious? And I think probably people wouldn't disagree with this. We're talking about spirituality. We're talking about questions about the ultimate and the sacred, which Father himself referred to as the sort of transcendent and immanent aspects of God. And I think this this is what corresponds to, as I understand it, or should correspond to what we mean by Cheon Il-guk. That is, Cheon Il-guk is not really a kingdom of this world. It's something fundamentally spiritual. It's something that we believe in. It's something that we feel. It's something that inspires us and should inspire us. We shouldn't fear it. It shouldn't be something that we feel is fundamentally wrong. It's something that we should feel deeply happy about. But I think the problem has been that people have tried to understand it in terms of earthly governance. And that's what it should not be. That's not to say that at some time in the future, a society might evolve that represents in some way our ideals of true love and peace and unity. But you cannot create that by diktat. It must be something that actually takes form over generations, perhaps centuries, who knows how long. But this idea itself is something that actually I believe we should believe in, and something that should inspire us and inspire what we do in our lives and inspire the way we behave and so on. Okay, I'll make it quick. The moral, I think, is and let me sort of cut to the chase with this. I think the moral is more relating to areas of what we mean by the church and the movement. And I think this is something that is subject to reform, and perhaps, you know, a constitution can be written for the movement which actually deals with many of the critical issues which the movement is encountering today about leadership and so on. And, you know, in that sense, I feel it is about the real world and something that needs real governance. And perhaps that's where the attention should be focused more. And I think it's the sort of conflation of these two worlds, if you like, that's actually causing the real problem for us. I think, thirdly, and I'm not going to dwell on this, the social aspect, which is not recognised at all in the Constitution, which is that we are a body of people who are related, you know, to each other socially, through our families, friendships, through organisations, and of course to the wider world as well. Let me just move them quickly to what I think the recommendations should be. Cheon Il-guk should be the final form of the restored humanity, as I mentioned before. Can't be created by any sort of diktat. And the focus of the Constitution should be on the positive values, principles and beliefs of unification that are likely to foster the emergence of such a world. The issues of practical government should be applied to the church and removed from the ideal of Cheon Il-guk. These, I think, particularly egregious sort of aspects of the Constitution should be removed, about suspension of rights, you know, and the regarding the disavowing of the Constitution. And finally, I think the divine principle should be restored. Father's own words about divine principle was, "This is my life."
Excellent.
So the Constitution was described as perhaps leaning towards theocratic socialism, also reflecting on the fact that there was no historical context to which this Constitution could be compared. There were certain assumptions of divinity, and also reflecting a bit on modernity and its accomplishments, and whether perhaps this Constitution has thrown away some baby with the bathwater, perhaps. Are there any questions or comments from the floor right now?
I thought that was really excellent. And yeah, I think you really nailed it at the end, the separation of the idea of Cheon Il-guk from the governance of the church. And the real problem has been to try to put the two together.
Right, Mr. Turfus and Mr. Sharp.
Hi, thank you, Donna. Very good what you said. I'd just like to take you up on one point, and maybe if any of the others on the panel would like to comment as well. How do we get rid of the bad leaders?
Do any of the panelists wish to answer that question?
Are there any bad leaders?
Well, there's, in the Constitution, it talks about bringing in national leaders through the vote of, a vote amongst all of the regional leaders or the spiritual leaders of the nation. So perhaps there's one question there. I don't know. First of all, you have to define the word bad. Actually, Father did set up I don't know, you must know about this, the father and grandfather principle many years ago, that if you do have a bad leader and you can't get through to him, then you can always go to his leader above him and complain. But that doesn't guarantee that you'll get rid of the guy or lady. There's no simple answer to that question.
Although in the Constitution, I think the election figures will be 4 years.
True.
So that may be, step by step, a mechanism whereby if we really follow that, people have a chance to vote.
Yeah, that's true.
I'll just say a couple of words and then ask Ollie to. I think Ollie wants to.
Just very quickly reply to this.
To what?
Said just now.
Okay.
A four-year term is a great security measure if, after those 4 years, the leader was appointed by a different set of people. Unfortunately, the same person who appointed the bad leader would also most likely be the same person serving their 7-year term, appointing the next leader after 4 years. So
And if they
good
didn't
point.
replace him during those 4 years because he was a bad leader, they're just going to reappoint him. Surely.
well, again, yeah. Anyway, the point is that the 4-year failsafe doesn't work from a top-down hierarchy. It works from a bottom-up
Right,
democracy.
What I wanted to share was that whenever I reflect on how to destroy an enemy, my cheesy answer is usually to turn them into a friend. And so rather than as someone who's in a position of leadership within our religious community, I would like to think that if there are aspects in which I'm performing badly, rather than boot out the bad leader, someone should take responsibility for scrubbing up the leader and make him a bit better. But perhaps this is a reflection on our organizational or leadership culture where there's not so much close management. We should develop a stronger culture of raising up our leaders and educating them and helping them to improve themselves to fulfill their full potential. I would be very grateful if someone took a great portion of their time to invest in me and help me to fulfill my potential. And likewise, if there are certain leaders we got beef with, then I think we should try to help them. Go ahead, please.
I just to say in response, Matthew, that your position is by definition the good leader, the one who recognises his inadequacies, is willing to change and is listening to the criticisms. I'm talking about the leader who may not be listening.
Good point.
And the point, Eddie, you made the point also, Eddie, about defining the bad leader. But I think what Don is saying is we cannot define the bad leader. What Karl Popper is saying is you cannot define the bad leader. That is the wrong question again.
All right.
The question is, if you decide that the leader is bad, you don't know what the definition of the bad leader is. If you knew what that was, you would not have appointed him in the first place. In the end, you have to say, we have to have the facility to make that decision while he's in power. He is a bad leader. We need to get rid of him. And he needs to know that we have that power and that he needs to be responsive to the people who will make that judgment on him and who will remove him from power. Then he is accountable to us. Then he can become a good leader. Then he becomes like Matthew. He's listening to us.
Also, I'd like to add that in my experience, when, for example, even in our church experience, when a member has an issue with something a leader has done or said, and the member asks for some time and speak to the leader, it's an unequal discussion. And the only way it really works is when a deputation speaks to a leader.
Yes.
Because when a member speaks to a leader, it's always like, this person's just a member, so what does their opinion make? But if I can just reply to what Don said, I didn't actually say that the Constitution would make us dependent on leaders. What I actually meant was the way the Constitution is written would actually render us powerless. So That it confers all the power on the leaders. So it's not that we lose our ability to desire freedom or to desire to have a say. It's just that we just don't have freedom in that with the way the Constitution is written.
Did Mr. Graham have a question? Or?
Yeah, it's just the comment to endorse what you said, the rules are, it's very different. You can't put a rule on Cheon Il-guk. Also, Cheon Il-guk, for me, when I joined, what didn't exist. It was the kingdom of heaven. So that was what inspired me, and the fact that people can live around the world as one family. That's just my definition of it. And you can't put limitations and you can't put statutes. Will happen. But then it's important that the organizations that are working towards that goal are organized in a way that everyone is harmoniously working together. So then it means that there is a need for a constitution for the implementation of the result, like that. When I speak, what I'm expressing is my heart. When I write, what I'm expressing is what's inside. When I read the Constitution, that is an expression of the heart of the leaders of this church, and I am profoundly worried. But at least it's coming out now, somehow. And last night I read the Constitution of North Korea, and they have elections every 5 years, not 4. It doesn't work there. So the Constitution is not going to fundamentally change our church. And the other thing is, we talk about love, and you can't put heart and love into laws. It doesn't work. The government that we have of this country is trying to control care homes, hospitals, with an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't work. It's only when the heart of a person changes that they then love the person they're taking care of. You cannot make a person love someone by ordering them to do it. And this Constitution, it says a lot, but it doesn't say the right things. And it's, I think, profoundly worried. I had a very superficial understanding of the Constitution. I've learned a lot by listening to this. And I can see a lot of people are worried. That is deeply worrying for me, that such a Constitution could have come out. And it really is coming across now that it was fast-tracked simply to protect true mother from the true children. And that is not, I would say, a good purpose for bringing out a Constitution. And it will bring a lot of problems, sadly.
If there are no more comments, last one, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
I've heard this mentioned several times throughout the day that the Constitution was created to protect true mother from true children, but I actually don't know what that means. So could somebody just give their thoughts on what that means? Colin, maybe?
Would any of the panelists like to?
No, it means, there's been a lot of talk about true children taking ownership of properties in America. I don't know if it's true, how true that is, because properties were put in their names, and there was a lot of scandals in Brazil about Korean leaders just misusing money, and there's all kind of things like that. So basically, one would have hoped if the true family had worked out exactly as father had hoped it would, then all of the true children would have been incredibly like father or like mother, incredibly responsible, living only for the sake of others, etc., etc. But unfortunately, it appears to be, I have to be careful with my words because I don't really know so much, that there's a power game going on. They even call it the Nim Wars, I heard recently. It's crazy name. So therefore, the last thing you want to do is to put powers into the hands of the NIMS.
So if it's just about assets, then surely they should say it's to protect us from true children.
Well, also the properties of the because of the third son taking ownership of an awful lot of stuff as well. So it's to protect what's left.
I think you'll also find
That's my understanding, limited as it is.
I think you'll also find that there are a lot of people out there who do want to be led.
Yeah.
Thank you for that comment and also all the other comments so far.